All right, let's go ahead and get started today. Don't forget that the next reflection essay is due tomorrow, so make sure to get that in. And then the first exam is next Tuesday. Our next class is the exam. I'll be checking my email throughout the weekend, so if you have anything between now and Tuesday, by all means, feel free to contact me by email. I'll be around on campus tomorrow and, of course, Monday, so you can certainly drop by then too. But if there's a question over the weekend, feel free to contact me then as well. So we are looking now at doctrinal development in the early Middle Ages. And so the cutoff we're thinking here is probably around 800 seems to be a good break. And so the next section will be from 800 on. And there are a couple of things that have continued and then some new things that are developing as well, especially when it comes to the issue of doctrine. Now, when we were talking about those migrations or invasions of those Germanic tribes, we noted how many of them had already been converted to an Arian form of Christianity, a form of Christianity that said that Jesus had been created, he hadn't always existed. And so there was that revival, bringing that up again when it had been thought pretty much settled. Also, in the early Middle Ages, there was a decision by the Catholic Church in the Synod of Orange in 529 that held Augustine's view of grace and works as the orthodox view, and that Pelagius' view about human effort and the power of human effort and human free will to be unorthodox. And so in the Middle Ages, there's still kind of this holdover, some things that we looked at in the 4th century, but attempts to finally rid those. But also, we see the continued debate and continued controversy over the nature of Jesus. And of course, when we were in the 4th century, we spent some time talking about these issues and trying to see how difficult and complicated they are as Christians tried to understand Jesus' nature. The Council of Constantinople, which was called toward the end of the 4th century, was supposed to put an end to this controversy, to set out the nature of Christ, but it did not. And so this continued debate and tension over Jesus' nature was something that continued even into the Middle Ages. But primarily, a lot of the debate and discussion is occurring in the eastern part of Europe. The West has pretty well settled. The major controversies that are going on at this time are largely about Jesus' divine and human natures. How can Jesus be both divine and human? How can the divine inhabit a human being? How can the God who has always existed live in human flesh? Now, largely, the West had followed the language of Tertullian. So what we see is the development of Catholicism, right? The Western Church, the Catholicism foundation, the Eastern Church, what we would call Eastern Orthodoxy, Greek Orthodoxy. Tertullian said about Jesus that there are two natures in one person. Now, those two natures, of course, would be the human nature and the divine nature. For Tertullian, that meant that Jesus had a human soul, but he also, in his flesh, encapsulated the Logos. Right? So the Logos and the human soul of Jesus of Nazareth were united in that physical body. But the Logos was the one that was always guiding Jesus, according to Tertullian. And so the nature of Christ did not change, but instead, it wasn't a change, it wasn't a transformation. Instead, the Logos was enveloped or clothed with flesh. Right? And so you think of somebody putting clothing on. That's kind of how Tertullian tries to explain it. Right? There's the divine Word, the second person of the Godhead, the Logos. And that nature doesn't change, it simply puts on flesh. With that, Tertullian said, each of those natures maintained its own qualities. Right? So Jesus was fully human, but also fully God. Right? So he doesn't just appear to be human, he is truly human. Right? He can be touched, he can bleed, he can die. But yet he is also internal in his Logos nature. And so each of these is maintaining their own qualities, but they are united in the person of Jesus Nazareth. The divine part, the Logos, is the one performing the miracles. The human part is the part that is suffering, right? The part that dies on the cross. But they are part of the same person. We've talked about, briefly mentioned, Origen's thoughts on this as well. Origen said, the Logos of the Father, the wisdom of God himself, was enclosed within the limits of that man who appeared in Judea. Now, remember, for Origen, his assumption is that everyone existed as souls prior to becoming human beings. So we were pre-existent souls. But those souls have fallen into sin, which has led to human existence. But Origen said there is one soul, one human soul, that did not fall, but was permanently united to the Logos. A complete union between human and God. Jesus, as Logos, had divine nature and human soul. And so it is this combination of Logos and human that is embodied through birth, suggesting that before Jesus was born, he had both a divine and human nature. Now, looking at that, what do you think of that view? Does that sound biblical? Does it make sense?
Kind of like Hercules.
Yeah, there's that kind of that quasi relationship. Other thoughts?
I don't think, if you believe that he already has the human nature, before then what would be the point in teaching and birth and the whole process of growing up and being human?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, you have to accept Origen's foundation that souls exist prior to conception or birth. Right? Do you believe that you existed prior to when you were born? Who were you before you were born? Yeah. What was your face before you had a face? I think the problematic here is this whole notion of pre-existing souls. It doesn't seem biblical. It doesn't seem like it makes sense to say that we existed in a spiritual form, fell into sin, and then were born as humans. That doesn't sound biblical to me. And so, let alone this whole concept then of somehow this human soul kind of becoming attached to the Logos. But this was, again, they're trying to come up with this explanation. I think Origen is off his rocker. But
it's just kind of off topic, but kind of on the same subject. I read an article one time, I can't remember who wrote it, but this guy was suggesting that when babies come into the world, they're attempting to learn another language. The noise that you hear them making is actually the language that they knew from being in the celestial realm prior to coming to Earth.
Now, what's interesting and kind of connected to that, and I would suspect that this might be the foundation for it. Within the theology of Mormonism is a similar type of concept, that there were pre-existent souls that fell into sin, and that's why they have to exist as human beings. And so I wouldn't be surprised if there was some background there. But, this is the kind of thing Origen is suggesting. I just don't find that in the Bible. It just doesn't seem to make sense. I mean, the whole point of Genesis 1 is to assert Adam's creation as a human being, and it is as a human being that he and Eve fall into sin. And so that doesn't seem to fly. But, Origen's very interested in Platonism and all those kind of things, and so that's where he kind of goes. Another individual during this time spoke out about this. Apollinaris of Laodicea. He was a friend of Athanasius. Athanasius was kind of the champion of Nicaea. And so he too is trying to take this very challenging issue of Jesus being human and God and trying to explain it. Ultimately, Apollinaris takes the view that Jesus did not have a rational human soul. Instead, in becoming human, the Logos took the place of that soul. So he did not have a human intellect, he had a divine one. And so that's where he's saying this statement, that if a perfect God were united with a perfect man, then there would be two sons. One by nature, the Son of God, and the other by adoption. Of course, we talked about adoptionism previously, and this idea that kind of human becoming divine judged as heresy. And so the Logos is in place of the soul and the mind of Jesus of Nazareth. And so Apollinaris says, no, he doesn't have a human soul, the divine soul. It is only the divine soul. And then with that is always the issue of the question of the will. Does Jesus have a divine will and a human will? And Apollinaris said, if we suppose that Jesus of Nazareth had a human will and a divine will, wouldn't those always be in tension? Right? Wouldn't there always be a struggle between our human nature and then Jesus' divine, unchanging, unsinful nature? So ultimately, Apollinaris said there is one nature in one person. Right? Tertullian, two natures, one person. Apollinaris, one nature, one person. But let me ask you this. What does that do to passages like Hebrews that talks about Jesus being able to be our high priest because he took on our nature? I mean, if it is solely the divine Logos present in Jesus of Nazareth with no human will or human mind that could possibly sin, would that make Jesus really a human being? Yeah, I mean, if it is completely impossible for Jesus of Nazareth to sin, then in the wilderness it's a pre-staged drama, right? I mean, there's no temptation there because there is no chance for Jesus of Nazareth to sin.
Kind of defeats the purpose of the thing being our example, because that would be an example of Jesus absolutely does not have that ability to sin.
And we would have to assume that God, in God's nature, right, has no ability to sin. You would think that if he had the ability to sin, that would just throw the universe into chaos, right? And so we have to somehow think about, well, there's got to be something human there with the will or the mind or the soul. Because ultimately, too, not just the temptations, but Gethsemane. What does that make Gethsemane? When Jesus is, he's dripping, he's got sweat coming off of him like he's bleeding from a head wound. And he's struggling and he's begging the disciples to stay awake with him. And he's asking God to take it away from him. What does this make that? It doesn't make it real. I mean, there really wouldn't be a struggle if he's not really struggling. So he has to have some sort of, and again, I don't think we can solve this. I don't think we're given enough in Scripture. to try and pin down exactly. But we have to have something there that has a human, at least, will to say, I could choose to do the wrong thing. Eventually in the East, two schools of thought developed around this issue. One was the Antiochene, largely centered in Antioch of Syria, and then the Alexandrine, which was centered in Alexandria, Egypt. Now, both of these schools agreed on one point, what we just got done talking about. God is divine, unchangeable, eternal. And so the divine nature always existed, always exists, is unchanging. But the difference between these schools ended up being between how do you have this unchanging nature who becomes a changing nature, right? I mean, we change. We change physically. We change mentally. And so human beings are changed. That's who we are. Example of that is what every 3 weeks you completely have new skin or whatever it is, right? And so the skin you have now is not the skin you were born with, right? And of course, don't think about that too long because you start, where does all that skin go? Right? But we're constantly changing by nature. So how does something unchanging become changing? The Alexandrians chose to focus on the side of divine. And so they emphasized Jesus as being our divine teacher. And ultimately, they emphasized the divine at expense of the human. Right? So much of their thought was focused on talking about Jesus and his divine qualities. And here's where you get mostly that kind of logos flesh model, right? That is completely unchanging, wrapped in human flesh. The Antiochenes, however, focused more on the human side. And while the Alexandrians were using terms like logos and flesh, the Antiochenes were talking about the word and the human. And they settled on the assumption that in order to save humanity, Jesus must be fully human. All right? And we talked about those passages from Hebrews. And so they looked at the Alexandrians as kind of diminishing the humanity in order to emphasize the divinity. So Jesus had to have a human soul for the Antiochenes. Gregory of Nazianzus said, Jesus only saves what he joined to his humanity. If he does not have a human soul, he cannot save a human's soul. And so the idea is, he's got to have a human mind for us as human beings to be saved. Ultimately, the Council of Constantinople rejected the views of Apollinaris, that one nature, one person.